Hello? There we go. Good morning. Sorry we had to get all of our technical issues worked out, but I think we've done that. Oh, I need the one more thing. The clicker to, there we go. No, that's usually not the one. No, that's not usually it either. Well, let's. I don't think it's on the podium. Nope. Very odd.
That's so bizarre.
Yeah.
Let me call Pastor. Sorry about this.
It's okay. Let me know what you find out. Mike, we could do it manually, just if you want to move it forward. You know what I mean? When I let you know. Okay. All right, let's get started. As you probably can tell, I am not Dr. Case this morning. And you probably know that he is a new grandchild that they have gone to visit with in New York City this weekend, so he asked if I could step in. I know nothing about loyal opposition, so we're not going to talk about loyal opposition today. Instead, we're going to talk about Aristotle. I'm sure you find that very exciting. But I promise you that he will be of interest to us because Aristotle is one of the few philosophers who has said something to us about friendship, and it's really friendship that I want to talk about today. What are friends? What's the basis of our relationship with people? And I want to talk about what we as Christians can learn from Aristotle's understanding of friendship. So he's going to provide for us a topology, if you will, of friendship. He thinks that there are different kinds of friendships that we develop, and the basis of those friendships determine the nature of those friendships. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Did we find it? No? All right. You want to go ahead and just move it forward for me? So he talks about this in the Nicomachean Ethics, his book called the Nicomachean Ethics. And a lot of people wonder, why is this particular book called the Nicomachean Ethics? And the reason is simply that after his death, his son, whose name was Nicomachus, actually edited the work and put it all together. And so it ends up being referred to as the Nicomachean Ethics. It's just the ethics that Aristotle wrote. And in there, in books 8 and 9, he talks to us about friendship and the nature of friendship. Mike, can I get you to move forward again? One more? There we go. And one more. So I want to start this morning by asking you this question. What are the characteristics of a good friendship? If you were to say, okay, this is what I think is important in a quality friendship, what would be some of those qualities or hallmarks, if you will, of a good friend? What do you look for? Compatibility. That is important, isn't it? Being able to relate to one another. Good. What else? Anything? Trust? Yeah, trust is oftentimes the basis for a friendship.
Yeah, empathy, they feel your...
Good. They're able to relate to you and the feelings that you have. Good.
Shared values.
Shared values. The fact that you share similar kinds of values. Someone over here? Acceptance. Okay, good. Those are the kinds of things I think that we think are important. Can you move forward again? There we go. Let me ask this. Are all of your friendships like that? That is, do you find that every friend that you have has commitments, has empathy, has people that you trust, people that accept you? Is that the way it is for every friendship that you have, or do you find the friendships can be different, can vary? What? Okay, well, I suspect, and I don't know, but I suspect that not all your friendships turn out exactly like that. And this is one of the things that Aristotle talks about. He talks about the fact that in the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about the fact that friendships are different depending upon how they get formed and why we form them. Some are better than others, I guess, is the best way to put it. So go ahead, Mike. So he identifies 3 types of friendships. Go ahead. There's friendships of utility, keep going, friendships of pleasure, and then one more, friendships of virtue, or sometimes it's translated friendships of goodness. He says, and we're going to have to think about this and talk about this a little bit, but he thinks all of our friendships that we form are one of these 3 kinds of friendships. Either a friendship of utility, a friendship of pleasure, or a friendship of goodness. And we'll sort of look at that and think about that. I want to start with friendships of utility. The friendships of utility, he says, are friendships that we form because they're useful to us. We form these kinds of friendships based upon mutual benefits. Both parties, if you will, benefit from these relationships. And these relationships then get formed because there's a benefit or usefulness in forming these kinds of friendships. Both sides benefit from them. Sometimes we don't spend a whole lot of time together. Sometimes we don't share the same values with one another. Sometimes, with regards to these friendships, oftentimes we don't share the same interests, but we form these relationships, he says, because we're sort of forced together or thrown together. And if I can get you to go forward again. He says these kinds of friendships tend not to last very long. What would be some examples, do you think, of friendships of utility? Friendships that we form because we're kind of co-workers is a perfect example of that, isn't it? We're sort of put together with coworkers and we form relationships with them because it's useful for us to do that. And when they're no longer our coworkers, or when we leave a job, those friendships tend to dissipate. Yes?
I was going to say college, because I got tossed into a
Yes.
dorm room with someone I had no clue who they were.
There you go.
We were friends,
Yep.
but we didn't know each other.
Yeah. Roommates are perfect examples, especially in college, right? You get thrown together with this person, you're thinking, who is this individual when they walk in? But you end up forming a relationship because you're thrown together. Yes?
Like our kids are in activities.
Yes.
We do things, we tend to, like last night they swam, we went out to dinner as a group.
Mm-hmm. There you go. There's a case where, again, you find yourself with these people This wasn't, you didn't necessarily intend to be with these people, but there you are. And so you begin to form relationships with them because of that kind of instance where your kids are involved in the same activities. Good, that's a very good example.
I think when you marry into a family or you're with another
Yes.
significant other or whatever,
Mhm.
you tend to form friendships with members of that.
Yep. Isn't that right? I mean, sometimes you're thinking, how did I get into this mess? Because they wouldn't necessarily be people that you would choose, but you end up having to spend time with them, and so you begin to develop naturally relationships with them. And then when those relationships end, or at least when whatever it is that brought you together, when your kids are no longer swimming, for example, then you find yourself ending those relationships. They're just no longer useful to you, right? I was thinking about neighbors. Sometimes we find ourselves in a neighborhood and we end up developing relationships with neighbors, and when they move away or when you move away, the relationships naturally end because it's no longer useful. Go ahead. Now, Aristotle says this. He says, these kinds of friendships are more typical of the elderly. And he doesn't say why, he says. These are typical of the elderly. And I thought, well, I wonder why he says this. And honestly, I don't know. Anybody have any suggestions as to why he says they're typical of people who are elderly? Yeah.
I was just thinking because they pass away. I don't know.
Well, maybe. Yes.
And what were the elderly back then? They were like 40, weren't they?
Well, that's a good question too. I'm not sure how old the elderly were. I found it odd. I'm like, so these are typical of the elderly. Why is that exactly?
For communal living arrangements, like.
Possibly. Yeah. Well, I was thinking oftentimes elderly will, like in senior living residence, for example, they'll be sort of, once again, forced together and forced to share meals together or do things together. You go to McDonald's for a cup of coffee in the morning and you see other people who are there your age, because those of us who are retired tend to do those kinds of things, sit around, and I'm thinking, well, maybe something like that. I honestly don't know why he thinks that. Barb?
Thinking because of wisdom of living longer, if you're going to waste your time or not. Developing a friendship.
There you go. That's a good point. Yeah, sometimes you're a little more selective as to who you choose to spend your time with. Yeah, maybe. I don't really know. It's an interesting observation that he makes, and I have yet to figure out why he thinks that. So we have these friendships of utility, friendships that are useful. He then says, we also form friendships of pleasure, which are based on something else. Go ahead. They're based upon mutual interests. That is, we, instead of gaining something from these relationships, we seek them out because we find something gratifying in the relationship. That is, we find a certain joy or pleasure in being with these people. And so on the basis of the pleasure or joy that we get, we choose to develop these kinds of relationships. And oftentimes these are based upon mutual interests, mutual hobbies, or mutual affiliations, or mutual values, or pursuits of some sort that we end up forming these kinds of relationships. What would be examples of friendships of pleasure as opposed to friendships of utility? You got any suggestions there with regards to, yeah?
developed friends from playing pickleball, and then we get together for meals, and we also play games and cards.
Good.
And we just found them, and it all gelled.
Yeah, it works because you share the interest in pickleball, and that becomes a basis then of saying, you know, I like being with them. There's a certain amount of pleasure that we get from being with them and sharing things with them, talking about pickleball. Good.
Don't you think we're always supporting each other? That true friend kind of brings you up a notch, and you bring them up a notch?
Okay,
You're
you're talking about true friendship. Hang on. Aristotle wants to go there too, but he's not there yet. He's going to say, well, yeah, there are those kinds of friendships too. So I'm going to just say, hold on, because he does want to talk about a third kind of friendship. This friendship's of virtue.
Season, and then their season's over.
Yeah, okay. You know, we form relationships based upon a softball team or a bowling team or something, and then once the season's over, we sort of, once again, those relationships sort of dissipate. Can you move it forward? Oh, you did. He says this. He says friendships of pleasure tend to be short-lived. That is, they change quickly, and for the very reasons that we were talking about. If you find yourself no longer interested or able to play pickleball, for example, then those friendships would probably dissolve, because the basis of the friendship, the pleasure that we get, or the gratification that we get with being with them, is no longer present. And so we find ourselves, once again, sort of ending those relationships. Go ahead. Thank you. He says this, that friendships of pleasure are typical of the youth. And again, doesn't say why, other than to make this pronouncement that young people tend to be forming friendships based upon pleasure, interest. Again, anybody have any ideas why he would say, pardon me?
move on in life.
Okay. It's a transitory.
College or high school or whatever.
Okay. Yes.
When you're younger, you're involved in like team sports and stuff like that.
Okay.
Or even I think of fishing buddies, you know, there's a great group that go fishing with maybe once a year or
Yeah.
something like that.
Sure. And then as we get older, we tend to lose those interests, or we stop pursuing those hobbies. That's very likely. I was thinking that one of these kinds of friendships of pleasure he's talking about is the kind of infatuation that you have as a young person. You meet someone and you're utterly taken with the person. And then as you get to know the person a little better, you're like, oh yeah, this person's not at all what I thought. And you sort of lose that passion. Or as the passion begins to wane, the interest begins to wane, the pleasure begins to wane, the friendship begins to dissolve or deteriorate. But for whatever reason, he says, there you are. Now, here are the hallmarks Aristotle identifies with these two types of friendships. He thinks there are specific hallmarks of them. Go ahead. First is, he says, they're fragile. That is, we don't form strong bonds with friendships of utility or friendships of pleasure. So they're not very strong relationships to begin with. Go ahead. Secondly, he says they're fleeting. You can see why, because you don't have those really strong relationships with this person, so they tend to be short-lived. One more. And he says, as you might guess, they're superficial. That is, they're not very deep, they lack commitment, there's really little investment. What's the common thread or common denominator with regards to friendships of utility and friendships of pleasure? What's the one thing that they share in common here. We said friendships of utility are friendships that we form based upon usefulness. We find them useful to us. Friendships of pleasure we form, he says, because we find them pleasurable for us. What's the common denominator there?
Self-directed.
Yes, precisely. They're self-focused, self-directed, exactly. They're looking internally. What advantage do these relationships have for me? Yeah. And the common denominator here is that the self-directed nature of these kinds of friendships. And because of that, Aristotle says, go ahead, that they're, as he puts it, imperfect. They're inferior types of friendships that are formed. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't cultivate these friendships, and it doesn't mean that they're unimportant. He just thinks that they're really not the best type of friendships. In fact, these are the gateway to a superior type of friendship, which would be these friendships of goodness that he talks to us about. Go ahead. So he says the third type of friendship that we form are friendships of goodness. And friendships of goodness, go ahead, are based upon the good of the other person. And here I think we're getting to this idea that with a friendship of goodness, we want to improve the other person. Basically, he says, we recognize something good in the other person. There's something about their character that we see of value, and we want to make that person a better person, a good person. And so we wish for the other individual to improve who they are. And we work towards improving them. And it's based upon, he says, their character. That is, there's something in who they are, something in the character of the individual that we resonate with, that we see as good. And we want to make that better even. We want to help them to flourish as a person. And so we work for their good. That is, we try to make them better people. Go ahead. He goes on to say, these kinds of relationships are few. We don't have a lot of these kinds of friends. They are, he believes, few and rare. This idea of focusing on the others, not focusing upon ourselves. And of course, there are those individuals who can never see beyond themselves. That's all that they do. But for many of us, we recognize something good in the other person, and we want to help make them into even better people. And to do that, he says, it takes a lot of time. Thank you. It's, as he puts it, time intensive. You have to spend a lot of time with them. You have to share a lot of experiences with them. You have to develop a kind of intimacy with them. And that's going to be, again, time intensive. You've got to spend a lot of time with them. You have to understand them. You have to understand what it is, he thinks, that improves them and makes them better. And that's, again, he thinks that's going to sort of involve a lot of work on your part. These don't just happen. You're going to have to work to make them happen. And again, because of that, he says, we have to be selective as to who it is that we sort of make that investment in, because of the investment that's involved. Again, it takes a lot of time, and you can't be the best friend to everybody. Although, again, there are some people who try to be the best friend of everybody, but you really can't. It's just, it takes too much energy, it takes too much time, there's too much of an investment. This kind of friendship just involves sort of this almost full attention to develop this kind of friendship. One more. And finally, he says one of the hallmarks of these friendships of goodness is that it involves mutuality. And here again, there's a reciprocity between the individuals. I want what's best for them, and they usually in turn want what's best for me. So we get this mutuality between these kinds of individuals. Let me ask you this. What would be examples of these friendships of goodness?
Are these actually steps in developing friendship? You just don't go from 0 to 100. All these, it seems like you go from one to the next to developing true friendship.
Well, sometimes we might, as I was saying earlier, sometimes friendships of utility can be a gateway into friendships of goodness, right? Or friendships of pleasure might be a gateway into friendships of goodness. Oftentimes, friendships of utility or friendships of pleasure never really develop much more than just friendships of utility or friendships of pleasure. But sometimes, he says, we develop into these much stronger, long-lasting, deeper, committed, there's another good word, committed kind of relationships. Now, come on, people. What's an example of this kind of friendship?
Say you're like a spouse or like a lifetime friend that you had maybe.
Yeah, wouldn't you think? I mean, I'm reading this and thinking, yeah, this is the relationship I want with my wife. This is the kind of relationship I expect to have with my spouse. And certainly, as you point out, there can be these friendships that no matter what happens and no matter where you are, those friendships remain bonded. There's a commitment to someone. They don't necessarily have to be your spouse, but they can be a true friend who you stay with or stay connected to, and you still want to help them to flourish and to be better people. And there's that mutuality. They want the same for you. Yes?
I was going to say, I always consider my sister my best friend.
There you go. I was going to say, the other thing would be siblings. Oftentimes, you get that same kind of bonding that sometimes siblings can fight, but sometimes they can also then develop into that kind of friendship of goodness that he's talking about. Yeah, there are family members, there are partners or spouses, or just these deep friendships that sometimes get developed, and the bond is again very strong, and they will last through thick and thin, as it were. But again, as he points out, it takes a long time. This doesn't happen overnight. And to a certain degree, they are evolving. Oftentimes, we start out with pleasure or we start out with utility, but then we develop into something more. And again, he says, because we have all of these experiences and relationships, and we see something good in the other person, we want to make that even better. Yeah, that's what he wants to talk to us about in terms of this kind of friendship as opposed to the other. Yes?
Does this type of friendship goodness occur de novo, or is it always dependent on a development from 1 and 2?
That's a good question. I suppose it could happen instantaneously, or spontaneously, right? Not instantaneously, but spontaneously. I would think that most of them start out at a different point. Again, either because we find pleasure with being with this other person, or because we find it useful to be with this other person, and then they tend to develop into something greater. But I don't think it necessarily have to. Go ahead.
The question comes from the stories that you hear. I saw him and I said immediately, I'm going to marry that man. Or I saw her. Are those...
Do you find those annoying? I find those incredibly annoying. I'm like, what?
Situation that Aristotle's trying to describe, or is that, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, well, I think what Aristotle wants to say is, yeah, it would be premature for us to meet someone and then say, that's the person I'm going to marry.
You hear that story.
Yes, you do. You hear it often. And he's going to say, you haven't known them long enough to make that assessment, because it has to do with, and I would think, I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and I would think what Aristotle would say is, in those cases, we're confusing passion with true friendship, right? We're thinking about, I'm just infatuated with this person, and I get great gratification with being with this person.
I get that.
Right. Rather than, go ahead.
Isn't that what generally people call their best friends?
Yes. Yes. These friendships of goodness, you mean? Yeah. You say, this is my best friend. This person has been in my life since I can remember, or since we first met, right? And it's, again, it's this idea of you have developed this relationship over time. You understand each other. You understand both the strengths and the weaknesses. We understand the foibles of the other person, and we're okay with that. Although we may think, I would like this person to flourish and to be even better or greater. And so we work to try to help them become a better version of who they are. And they work to make us into a better version of who we are,
This seems to be typical among women. Almost every woman I know says, this is my best friend. I've yet to have a guy ever introduce another guy and say, this is my best friend.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good question.
And some,
I don't know.
My best friend's husband wanted a friend like Barb and I have.
Yeah.
And, it just, I moved in next door to Barb and her family when my husband went overseas. And I think it was a God placement, because he didn't come back. And Barb and I and our families are like one. Unfortunately, her husband has passed away, but she even said if she went first, that Jack should marry me. So, that's pretty close.
That's pretty close.
Thank God he went first.
Yeah, and you know what? I was just going to say, I think men do want to have those kinds of friendships.
He wanted one like we have.
Yeah,
I
but
think women have the time, men are too busy and never have the time to develop that type of friendship.
I don't know if men are self-aware enough to develop those kinds of friendships, or we're afraid. Go ahead.
It's harder for men.
I think so.
I think this is a gross stereotypical.
That's okay.
Overarching thing, but I think women are better on the empathy end of things.
Yeah, I would say that too, or at least are willing to talk about that.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I'm not really all that comfortable with talking about those kinds of things, although they are important to me. If I were to be honest with you, it's like, yeah, I really would like to have those kinds of close relationships. But it's oftentimes hard to admit that. And so perhaps why one sex is more likely to identify a best friend than the other. I don't really know, but that's sort of the sense that one comes up with.
I don't think women try to one-up each other. They're equal, usually.
Right.
Best friends are equal.
Right.
Men,
It's always a competition.
there's always a competition.
There may be something there too. Yeah, we may. That's a good point, Barb. That we oftentimes find ourselves feeling competitive rather than developing that kind of mutuality that Aristotle's talking about. Got a couple questions for you to think about. Question number one: do you think there are other types of friendships besides these three? Aristotle says, here are the three types of friendships. Friendships fall into, generally, broadly speaking, they fall into these three categories: utility, pleasure, goodness. Are there other kinds of friendships that you can think of?
Most would be an acquaintance.
Okay. Is that acquaintance, again, a result of it's useful to have that acquaintance? Is it pleasurable to have that acquaintance? Interesting. I've thought a lot about this. I've taught Aristotle for a long time, and I've sort of come to the conclusion, yeah, I think Aristotle may be right about this, that broadly speaking, our relationships seem to fall into these categories that he's identified. They're either useful, they're either gratifying, or there's something deeper, this friendship of goodness or virtue that he talks about. I've sort of tried to think about, well, what other kinds of friendships are there? And I have to admit, I really can't think of any that somehow don't sort of fall into one of these three categories. But, again, it's easy to sort of miss something sometimes. Question number two. What do you think Aristotle gets right about friendship in his discussions of it? What do you like about Aristotle's typology here? And you can probably guess what the third question is going to be, but we'll get to that in a minute. What do you think what do you like about Aristotle's typology here? Okay, there's a certain rationality to what he's describing. This is oftentimes the way things seem to play out. And Aristotle, by the way, is a very pragmatic philosopher. He's always talking about pragmatically, how do we make this work for ourselves in our lives? That's one of the hallmarks of Aristotle's writings. Unlike Plato, who's sort of in the ether, Aristotle's very down to earth.
You think he had all these kinds of friends, or is he too smart?
Ethereal? I think he probably did. I think he's sort of looking at his own experiences and saying, yeah, this is sort of the way I see how my relationships go, and probably where he came up with those.
And it's okay. It's like permission. You can have friends that aren't all your best friends.
Yes, and that's a good point too, really. It is important to be able to say, not every friend has to be my very best friend. I can be friends with people, and I can value their friendship even, but realize that, it's because we find ourselves working together or being together or living close by or sharing interests or sharing values or sharing pursuits without necessarily having to go a whole lot deeper than that. And then, of course, there are those best friends that we truly value and want to do what we can to make them better. Yes?
Maybe I missed this, but what was the limited bit?
Oh, just that you can't have a whole bunch of these friendships. You can't have like 10 best friends.
Okay, I thought the friendship was limited.
No, he was just, well, at least what he meant was you have to sort of be selective here when it comes to friendships of goodness. Just because, again, he thinks it involves so much. It's so much time and so much energy and so much sharing that you really can't develop lots of these. Yes?
I just thought of another thing is jealousy. You cannot be jealous of your best friend. He or she is going to have other friends, do other things, but rather than this junior high kind of thing, like you're my best friend today, but not tomorrow, and all of that, you cannot have that in a mature relationship.
Best friend.
Yeah, because the jealousy is self-directed, right? It's like, I don't want that, right? It doesn't make me feel good, or it makes me feel angry. As opposed to looking externally to them and saying, what's best for this person, right? And so you're right, jealousy doesn't fit in there. Although jealousy can certainly fit into friendships of utility or even friendships of pleasure, right? They like being with these other people more than me, and we can find ourselves, yeah.
Isn't part of this mindset, think of the movie You've Got Mail.
Uh-huh.
Anymore, people can get on the internet and develop a friend, and they never see him, don't even know a thing about him.
Yeah.
But they develop it in their mind, they become a close friend even.
That's interesting. There was an article actually this week in the New York Times about friendship. It struck me because I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about that on Sunday. And what they said there basically was that Americans have a very difficult time forming true friendships. And I was thinking, yeah, they're really talking about these friendships of goodness, and that Americans, and there was a study done by the American Sociological Society or something like that, where they were saying Americans have very few friends. And perhaps that kind of internet, reaching out on the internet is an attempt to sort of address that sense of a lack.
There was artificial friends.
Yeah, but it also is an indication of our need for those relationships and the fact that we don't really have those relationships. Yeah. Yes?
Okay, so showing my bias here, but I think sports is kind of like a contradiction to what Aristotle said was limited, because if you are a team, the whole goal to be, okay, so they call it the ego player and the mastery player. The ego player plays for himself, the mastery player plays to master the sport.
Right.
But in a team situation, you have to befriend all of those members on your team to be a good team. You have to
Do you?
befriend them all to the point that you make each other better.
Oh, okay,
If you're going to be a good team.
that's true.
Otherwise, you got a bunch of ego players, and those teams oftentimes fail.
Yeah.
So I think there might be some. I would, if I was the loyal opposition to Aristotle today,
Good.
I'd say, sir, I
Thank you.
disagree with you on this. We can't limit our goodness, and maybe that is the Christian calling to be a better team.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe that's where you're going.
Although, well, no, I wasn't, but that is interesting. Yeah, and maybe there is another kind of friendship that involves, sort of stepping aside. In one sense, that what you're talking about there, that cohesion that happens on a sports team, for example, is that willingness to put our own interests aside and look to the interests of the whole. Well, two things come to mind. Number one, maybe this is at least a form of friendships of goodness that he's talking about, although I think it doesn't involve that kind of depth that he thinks is involved in friendships of goodness. The other is, maybe there's a fourth kind of friendship, which isn't as deep or as meaningful, as committed, let's say, as the friendships of goodness, but nevertheless a a kind of friendship where you're thinking about how do we all get better? Although understand that part of what's driving that is our desire to succeed, right? So that because I'm part of this team and I want this team to succeed because I want to succeed, in a way, it may fit into this idea of friendships of utility. You know, I'm really hoping that we'll win the national championship or whatever, because I would want that for myself, rather than truly thinking about what's going to make these players better players. I want them to be better players because I want to get something from the experience. And I don't know, that's, you know, something that we'd sort of have to think about and sort through.
So can we transform our relationships would be the
Yeah.
corollary of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Can we grow into, and is there
Yeah.
a transformation?
And certainly, I would say, certainly there are times when we transform our relationships from either utility or pleasure into goodness, but I really can't do that with an entire football team or baseball team or hockey team or whatever. At least in Aristotle's thinking, there's too much involved. There's too much depth. Let's go on to the next question. What does he get wrong about the nature of friendships, do you think? What has he missed here? Has he missed anything when it comes to our friendships? Anything strike you as, oh, Aristotle hadn't thought about that, didn't think about this, or didn't think about that? And it's a tough question for a Sunday morning after we've lost an hour of sleep.
Maybe the idea of trust being involved in the friendship of goodness.
Okay.
And the level of commitment. I was thinking about in the workplace, hearing coworkers bashing their spouses or a child, airing dirty laundry and things. And I was always shocked by that, thinking, where has this trust broken down that you would share this with other lesser friends, much lesser friends, and talk about the person who should be the dearest to you, and whose secrets are firmly kept, in confidence and so forth. I don't know, it was just always shocking to me that people would talk about those things openly. I think trust is the hot.
I think trust is important to Aristotle's notion of goodness or friendships of goodness. And it is interesting. You're right that sometimes people can speak negatively about that most important person. I think that's probably a betrayal then. It's a betrayal of these friendships.
Don't matter. I mean, not that
They're friends of utility or friends.
they're friends of utility.
Yeah, right.
They may not be their friends for very long.
Right. And I mean, I think that's sort of a call for us to be more circumspect as to what we say to others, because you're right. There's certainly a sense of trust that ought to be present. Let's move on to the next. By the way, thanks. That was very interesting. I want to ask this question because we're beginning to get near the end of class time. So what should we take from Aristotle? And of course, the answer's right there. Sorry, we went one too far. But I think what's interesting about Aristotle is he seems, at least in Friendships of Goodness, to be talking to us about agape love, this idea of can you hit it again, Mike? This idea of self-sacrificial love. What he's talking to us about is sacrificing our good for the good of somebody else. And of course, this notion of agape love is endemic in the New Testament. There's something like 116 references in the New Testament of agape love. There, obviously, we're familiar with the fact there are different kinds of love mentioned in Scripture, but in the New Testament, there's at least 116 different references to agape love. Can you hit again? I just want to hit a couple of them really quickly. One here is found in 1 John. 1 John 3, 16 and 17 says, we know love, agape, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? And what we see here, I think, are two things. Number one, agape love, self-sacrificial love, means that we have to sacrifice, that it's going to cost us something. You know, not yet. The second verse there, you know, how can you say, you know, you have love if you're not willing to sacrifice something, if it doesn't cost you something? The kind of love that he's talking about here, agape love, is costly. And we're willing to do, or ought to be willing to do, whatever we can to provide that kind of love. Okay, go ahead to the next one. 1 Corinthians 13, very famous, obviously, the famous love chapter. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 and 6. Love, agape, is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no records of wrong. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Here's a powerful description for us of what agape love looks like. And again, I think at least part of what Aristotle's talking to us about is this kind of relationship that we want to form. One more. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Christ's words here on the Sermon on the Mount. And these are really, really hard words. I've been convicted all week about these, well, more than the week, but certainly preparing for this class have been thinking about these words and thinking how very, very difficult these are. Try to bring up a visual in your mind. Think of someone who you would identify as an enemy. And then ask yourself, would I be willing to sacrifice my good for theirs? And I have to admit, that's an extremely difficult thing. And yet, it is what this agape love sort of demands of us. One last question. How is agape love as described in the New Testament distinct or different from Aristotle's notion of these relationships that we form out of goodness? They're talking about self-sacrificial love. What's the difference? Is there a difference? Yes?
I think here we're not talking about it.
Good.
We're not talking about
Yeah.
it. We don't make friends with our enemies.
Yep.
We do not make friends
Yes.
with just anybody.
I think that's exactly right. There's a reason why I ended up with Matthew 5. It's because Aristotle says, yeah, you can do this with your best friend, right? It's possible to create these kinds of relationships with your friends. Christ is saying something very, very different here in the Sermon on the Mount. He's saying we should be willing to do this with our enemies, right? Which is vastly different and extremely, much more difficult for us to do. Yeah, that struck me too, that Aristotle's talking about something that we might be able to do because they're our best friends. Christ is calling us to something even higher, even more challenging, even more difficult. Yes?
I think you hit it. I was going to say the time element is the difference, right? If you are attacked by someone you don't know who's a stranger, he technically is your enemy.
Yeah.
He attacks you. That's not the same relationship as Aristotle was talking about, because you've emphasized how much time it takes. So is the spontaneous threat of danger
Right.
your enemy? How do you define it? The definition is key here, but the key factor is time.
Yep. And to be fair, Aristotle's talking about relationships, right? We're developing relationships for various reasons. And that's not what's going on here, obviously. Christ is not talking to us about developing, well, maybe Christ is talking about developing relationships. But it is talking about our being willing to sacrifice our good for others.
Somebody's got to help me, and I apologize. What was the movie with, and he dressed up in the suit and he went over and he let the kids shoot him, and it was the car, the Gran Torino. Who was the actor? Clint Eastwood.
Oh.
Did you see that?
I didn't, sorry.
Yeah, he sacrificed these kids, these punks, these neighborhood kids are beating up these other Oriental children in another household. And Clint goes through this whole thing, gets dressed up with this Gran Torino and entices them, and they wind up shooting him for the car. But he did it to protect these kids.
Okay.
It was amazing.
Okay.
Short movie, Gran Torino.
That idea of self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a complicated and difficult thing for us to imagine. Yeah. And yet we find ourselves being told, this is what we should be willing to do. Sacrifice our good for the good of those who despise us. And that's an incredibly difficult thing for us to, and of course there are many people who simply find ways to minimize this or ignore it or change it into something that's much more palatable. But in point of fact, we're called to this kind of self-sacrificial love. Is there anything else here that you want to point out or talk about before we leave?
These are all New Testament examples.
Right.
Can you do the same in the Old?
Probably. You're not going to find agape, because that's a Greek term, and the Old Testament's in Hebrew. But I don't really know how to answer that. I would imagine yes, you could, but.
Was that Abraham killing his son? Was that a sacrificial?
Perhaps following God's command. Yeah, in Genesis 22, when Abraham takes his son Isaac to the mountains of Moriah and sacrifices him, or at least attempts to sacrifice him.
When you talk about the downside in some ways of this, that I'm thinking of a friend that he was complaining to me because he loaned money to his brother and his brother had not. This is true. And that paid him back. And then he said, besides, he said, I wasn't even going to charge me interest. And through my mind, I'm saying, what kind of a friend our brother is. And then I'm saying to myself, well, what kind of a guy am I to be judging my friend? Looking down on, it takes a lot of looking at your own character to be a friend.
Yeah, and of course, that's sort of the basis for Aristotle, is looking at the character. Who are we? Who are we really as an individual, right? Yeah. Let's end with a word of prayer, if we could. God, your words are hard sometimes, and we struggle to know how to be like Christ in our daily lives. Give us both wisdom, understanding, and patience as we attempt to follow your teachings and follow your way of life. We pray these things through the power of Christ our Savior. Amen. Thanks so much. I think Dr. Case will be back next week, so you can continue with loyal opposition. Thanks.